Hello everyone, we want to thank you for joining us on the Mouth of Richland podcast today. We hope you are encouraged and challenged by today's sermon. If you can join us live, we'd love to have you Sundays at 11 o'clock, or you can find more about us on our Facebook page or YouTube page. Again, thanks for joining us, and we pray you enjoy today's sermon from our senior pastor, Pastor Nick.
Back to the book of Esther. We are going to be finishing up the book of Esther today. We'll be finishing our series, and today's sermon is entitled God's Plot Twist. And if you have ever seen a good movie, there's always a plot twist that's normally part of the movie that you just never saw it coming. It catches you way off guard, and you're like, oh man, I can't believe that happened. And probably one of the most famous plot twists in all of history, and this is spoiler alert, if you've never seen Star Wars, I'm about to ruin it for you, that Darth Vader is Luke Skywalker's father. I was a huge, Greg's down here going, what? I was a big Star Wars fan growing up, not much into it anymore. I liked the lightsabers and the action figures and all that kind of stuff. And I remember watching that when I was little. I knew before I saw the movie that the twist was there, and so it wasn't this huge thing for me. I was like, oh yeah, I've known that kind of deal. But I heard a kind of like a behind the scenes thing that when they were writing those movies, the only people that knew that the twist was coming was, of course, the guy who wrote the movie, George Lucas, the actor that played Darth Vader's voice, and the actor that played Luke Skywalker. Only those three people knew for like 2 years that the twist was coming, and they didn't tell anybody. And so even like the guys filming it, when it happened, like the guys filming it, they were like, we didn't know that, we didn't know that was about to happen, and so like it was this huge plot twist, and there's like stories where when people were in the theaters watching Star Wars, and when he says, "No, I'm your father," people being like, gasping out, because they just could not believe that this was happening. Today we're going to read about a pretty interesting plot twist in the story of Esther, and it's pretty unfortunate for one of our characters. And his name is Haman. If you remember, last week we were at the point in the story where Esther, who is a Jew, is queen of Medo-Persia. She is the queen of the known world. And Mordecai, her cousin, who is also a Jew, had been honored because he stopped an assassination attempt on the king. And they wrote him down in the history books that Mordecai stopped the assassination attempt, and he had been elevated to a high stature in the kingdom. And then we were introduced last week to a man named Haman, and he's a wicked man. He is a descendant of a wicked people, and Mordecai was a descendant of God's people, and so they were natural enemies. And we saw that because he hated Mordecai so much, he didn't just take his hatred out on Mordecai, but Haman wanted to extinguish the Jewish people. And he actually came to the king and he said, I want to make a law that on this day in a few months that you will send armies and that people can rise up against the Jews, kill all the Jews here in Persia and kill them all the way back to Israel and completely make them an extinct people. And so we see that Haman definitely is the villain of the story. He is being influenced by sin and by Satan to carry out an evil deed against the people of God. And so what we saw was Mordecai and the Jews began to mourn. Esther stepped in, though, as queen and put her life in her hands to go up and question the king's decree and said, hey, I have a request. And the king says, what is it, most beautiful, wonderful Esther? You can have anything you want. And she doesn't say, let's save the Jews. She says, I want a banquet. And she says, I want you to invite Haman to come to the banquet. And so Haman comes to the banquet. He is honored at the banquet. And as he's leaving, he sees Mordecai, and his hatred burns for Mordecai. and he builds a gallows to hang Mordecai from because he hates him so much. And that's where we left last week. So we left on a cliffhanger a little bit, right? What's going to happen to Mordecai? Are the Jews going to die? What's going to happen? And so this morning, for the sake of brevity, I'm not going to read a lot of the actual scriptures. I'm going to summarize and read little portions because there's a whole lot of detail there that's interesting, and you need to study it for yourself, but it's not vital for what we're going to look at this morning. So I'm going to summarize chapter 6 here. That's where we're going to begin, Esther chapter 6. I'm going to summarize this chapter, but I will read just a section here to set the scene. So after Mordecai made the gallows, beginning in chapter 6, we see this. That same night, the king, being Ahasuerus, could not sleep. So one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. So we need to know what's happening here. Esther is all about God's providence, God's handiwork in their everyday lives. And isn't it interesting that the king, Ahasuerus, didn't have a sleeping problem a couple nights ago. He didn't have a sleeping problem last night. It tells us that he had a sleeping problem this night. And there was a reason for it. God made him unable to sleep so that he would call for the records to be written to him. Because if you remember, in our first week, we discussed that when Esther became queen and her cousin Mordecai stopped the assassination attempt, what happened? He was brought before the king, and the king said, "Thank you so much for doing this. You're going to be written into the royal records. You're going to be in the history books for what you did." And when you read that, you're like, well, that's pretty cool, but it doesn't seem very significant. Well, it turns out to be extremely significant. Ahasuerus can't sleep, and he asks for the records to be read from him, the royal records, which had hundreds, if not thousands of years of history. And what do you think was read to him? Look at verse 2. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of, and this is a weird name, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai?" And the servants who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." What are the odds out of the hundreds, if not thousands of years of written history of the Persians that he goes, "I can't sleep, bring me the history books," and they just so happen to bring the portion that talks about Mordecai saving his life when Haman had just planned to hang Mordecai the next day? That's the Lord, obviously, right? That is God working here. And so there is the beginning of our plot twist. And they just so happen to read these events. So Ahasuerus wants to honor Mordecai in a great way. So we see the next day, Haman is invited to the next banquet. And he comes walking in, feeling all high and mighty. "I'm going to hang Mordecai today. I'm going to kill that guy. I'm going to carry out what I wanted to do." And when he walks in, Ahasuerus says, "Hey, Haman, I have a great honor for you." And he's like, "Bring it on. Bring it on. I'm ready for more honor." And he goes, "There's a man in the kingdom named Mordecai, and he deserves to be honored." And Haman is like, "What? What are you telling me I've got to do?" He wants to honor Mordecai, and he asks him to lead the parade that honors Mordecai. So he goes from the night before wanting to hang him, so where the next day, Haman has to dress Mordecai in the royal robes. Haman has to prepare the parade to take Mordecai through the streets, and he leads the horse that Mordecai sits upon. Can you just think about how mad Haman had to be that day. Thinking, I'm going to kill him, and then instead he parades him through the town, and everybody's going, "Oh, Mordecai, you're the best for saving the king." And steam just had to be coming out of Haman's ears. And so what I want you to see is, number one, what we see in chapter 6 is that God is working powerfully here. He ordained the fact that he couldn't sleep. He ordained the portion of Scripture, the history books that they would read. And it's obvious that God has a sense of humor, because this is funny stuff. I mean, in a way, it's hilarious. I mean, he is thinking, I'm going to go kill this guy, and then he ends up having to parade him around town in royal robes and on a horse. I mean, can you just imagine the humiliation? So our plot twist begins to turn even farther, and it is just super ironic what has to happen here, from great anger to honoring Mordecai. So now, as we enter into chapter 7, I want to call chapter 7 Haman's horrible, terrible, no good, bad day. And it only gets worse for poor old Haman. So now I will read a little bit of this because it's just almost too comical not to read. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And on the second day at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition?" Queen Esther, "It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Up to half the kingdom? And it shall be done." And Queen Esther answered and said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and it pleases, let my life be given at my petition and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. We have been sold as male and female slaves. I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss." So King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, "Who is he and where is he? Who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing?" And Esther said, "The adversary and the enemy is this wicked Haman." So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. And the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. And when the king returned from the palace garden to the palace of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. And the king said, "Will he also assault the queen while I'm in the house?" As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Now Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, "Look, the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman." And the king said, "Hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that had been prepared for Mordecai, and the king's wrath subsided. Can you imagine the things running through Haman's mind while all this is happening, right? He thinks he's like, "Man, yesterday was horrible. I had to parade Mordecai around, dress him in those robes, and I hate that guy." But he's like, "At least I can have my banquet with the queen and the king today, and they're going to honor me surely." So he shows up at the banquet. He's sitting down there. Can you just pleasure me for just a second about my imagination of what's going to happen? Haman's sitting down there stuffing his face, being like, "Oh man, this food's good." And Esther begins to talk, and he's like, King says, "What do you want, Esther?" And he's probably thinking, "I hope she says another banquet, because these 2 days have been awesome, you know." And she's like, "I want you to save my people." And then Haman's like, "Oh gosh, what? She's bringing up the whole thing. She's bringing up the whole thing that I want to do." And he's like, "But that's the law. The king he'll go along with it. He'll say, Esther, I can't do that. It's law." And instead, Ahasuerus goes, "Well, who is this man that wants to do this evil?" And you can just imagine her going, "He did it," right? You know, pointing at Haman and him and dropping the food out of his mouth and just being dumbfounded of the turn of events. And so the king in his anger exits, and Haman runs up to Esther and he's like, "Please, please have mercy on me," which, I mean, he wasn't saying that, you know, about how evil he was being earlier. Now that it's turned, he wasn't going to show mercy, but now that it's turned, he's begging for mercy. So he's laying there saying, "Please, please, please." And apparently he had prostrated himself in such a way that when the king came back in, he thought he was assaulting Esther for what was happening. And so his anger even burns greater for what's going on. And so his day just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And in the greatest plot twist and the greatest irony, he goes, "You know what? You deserve to die for what you've done. And not only are you going to die, you're going to hang on the same gallows that you prepared for another man." And he sure did. He hung and was killed on the gallows that he prepared for Mordecai. So it's just the greatest irony there that we see the Lord working and just humiliating Haman and the evil deeds that he had tried to carry out. And I had this thought as I was studying this, you know, one of these days, Satan is going to act the same way Haman did. One of these days, God is finally going to, as they always say, split the eastern sky and come back for us, and Satan's going to be like, oh no, it's over. It's done. And Jesus is going to say, you bet it's done. And the same thing is going to happen. God is going to work in such a powerful way to just stop evil in its tracks. The same way that He did here to stop the death of Mordecai and to kill this wicked and evil man, Haman. So now, let's continue here in chapter 8 and chapter 9. Very quickly, I just want to tell you what happens in chapter 8. So, Esther and Mordecai are honored for their work in the kingdom there and for stopping Haman. And if you remember, when Haman was allowed to go make the first law to kill the Jews, it told us that Ahasuerus gave him his signet ring. So they took the signet ring off of Haman and they gave it to Esther and Mordecai so that they could go and make a law. And what they did is that they were allowed to make a law for the Jews to defend themselves. And you think, well, why didn't they just make it a law that they couldn't kill the Jews? Well, in Medo-Persian society, once a law was put into order, it could not be canceled. You couldn't make a counter law against it. All you could do is make a law to try to slow it down or to try to prevent it, but you could not make a law to stop it. Why they did that, I'm not sure, but that's just the way they worked. And so they couldn't just make a law that said, we can't do this. They had to make a law to allow the Jews to defend themselves when the fateful day came and Haman's evil plot would have been carried out. And so Mordecai and Esther are lifted up, and Esther was already queen, but Mordecai was given the ability to go out and to tell all the Jews to prepare themselves to fight for what was coming. And so then that takes us to chapter 9, and I want to quickly read a small section of chapter 9 here. It says, now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, this is a beginning of chapter 9, on the 13th day, the time came for the king's command and his decree to be executed. On the day that the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred. I love that. On the day that the Jews' enemies had prepared to overpower them, the opposite occurred, in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. The Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. And no one could withstand them, because fear of them fell upon all people. And the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work helped the Jews because their fear of Mordecai fell upon them. So the plot twist, right, it just keeps twisting. We go from the Jews mourning and weeping and wailing a couple chapters earlier to they're taking up arms and they're defending themselves, and it says no one could withstand them. The Lord had empowered them, had given them the ability to fight back, to destroy the evil, to destroy those that had come against them. And this really gave me a thought that I want us to kind of dwell on for just a moment. And I'm going to close us out here just with a couple of thoughts that I want you to think about. When the Jews defend themselves, I think it shows us something pretty poignant for our day and time. They could not make a law that just simply took their problems away. They made a law that allowed them to defend themselves. And so what we see here is that God made it possible not to just take all their issues away, not to just make life easy, but He made it possible for them to defend themselves. He made it possible for them to rise up against evil. Or a simple way to say it is, He prepared them for the evil that was coming. And I want you to know that that's exactly what God does in our lives. He doesn't just take our issues away most of the time. He doesn't just make life easy peasy to where there's no issues, no conflict, no sadness. But He does take time to what? Prepare us for what's coming. Question is, are we taking time to allow Him to prepare us? Are we being faithful enough to Him to allow Him to prepare us for what's coming? If we have faith, He will prepare us and help us deal with any problems that come our ways. And you can think about it in the most basic way. God didn't just remove sin from the world. When Adam and Eve sinned, He didn't go, oh, y'all messed up, let me just take that back. What did He do? Things were set into motion that what? It all started leading up to Jesus to come and die on the cross. He didn't just remove sin. Jesus had to suffer and die. And now we have an answer to sin. Now He has prepared us to deal with sin. And that the answer and the way we deal with sin is to come to salvation. And I think the reason He does this is about what we're about to see here in the ending of Esther. When Jesus dies on the cross, we have something to point back to now and say there's a sign of the faithfulness of God. There's proof of the love and the goodness and the grace and the faithfulness and the work of God in our lives. It'd be easy for God to just take stuff away. He could do it. But what does that teach us? How does that develop our relationship with Him? You think Esther and Mordecai ever doubted God ever again after this? Probably not. Man, they had seen God do wonderful things. They had seen God work powerfully in their lives. And He could have just taken it all away and they'd have been like, well, I guess it's gone. At least we don't have to go through anything. But man, they wouldn't have been the people they were. They wouldn't have loved God the way that they did. They wouldn't have served God the way that they did. They wouldn't have had the opportunities to stand up for what was right, to step out on faith, to show their faith in God, to learn the faithfulness of God. I want you to think about it. How many times does God work in Scripture and they continually point back to it? Think about Exodus. All through the Bible, all the Israelites do and say, think about what happened there when He led us out of Egypt. Think about how He fed us the manna. Think about how He led us through the wars and the battles in the wilderness. Think about how He gave us water from the rock. Think about how He let us cross the Jordan and He told them to bring stones out of the Jordan and build monuments so they could point back to something and say, that is a sign of the faithfulness of God. Think about the faith that it took for them to march around the city of Jericho and try to destroy it by simply screaming at it. That took faith. But they could point back and say, look what He did. Think about them being delivered from exile and pointing back to the 70 years in captivity and being able to say, man, those were hard times, but look how God brought us out of it. And here in Esther, we see something that they create to be able to point back to and to honor God for the work that He had done in their life. A new Jewish feast is created, and it's called the Feast of Purim. And it's taken from the Hebrew word for lots, casting lots. And it's actually kind of sarcastic that they name it this because Haman decided what day to kill the Jews by casting lots. And so they're saying, we're going to humiliate the fact that he left our fate up to lots by naming the festival of our deliverance after lots. That we, by chance, it was that day, and we're making fun of the fact that he left it up to chance. And we are going to call this the Feast of Purim. And so for thousands of years, this feast has been done to remember the deliverance here in Esther. And they still practice this feast today. But I want you to think about something. They could not celebrate deliverance if there was nothing to be delivered from. If the trial had not happened, there was nothing to celebrate when God delivered. It made the deliverance sweet and the praises to God meaningful. And so it's very simple this morning as we wrap it up here. You might have something going on in your life and you may just be begging God to take it away. Maybe there's something personal going on in your life nobody else knows about. Maybe it's not so personal. Maybe people do know about it. Maybe you're just struggling with everything that's going on in the country. Maybe you're scared of the coronavirus. Maybe you're scared of the riots and the social unrest. You're scared of the future of the country. I don't know. And you may just be saying, God, take it away, take it away, take it away. And I don't think there's anything wrong with praying that. But I will say this. We don't need to overlook a chance to see the work of God in our lives. We don't need to overlook an opportunity that, yeah, we're in a dark time right now, but one of these days we're going to come out of it. And when we do, we're going to be able to point back and say, wow, look at the way God worked in our lives. Look at the way He moved in our lives. And it will make this time seem worth it. It will make the deliverance so sweet. And maybe you're here this morning, and maybe you've never experienced the grace of God in your life. Maybe you can't even point back and say, look at what God did in my life when He saved me from my sins. Well, that's why Jesus went to the cross, so that you could point back and say, He died for me. He bled for me, so that I can come to salvation and repentance. So I just want to say this morning that you may be going through trials, you may be going through a hard time, but don't overlook the fact that God's going to be working in that time. God's going to be moving in your life, and there may just be something there for you to learn from and to grow from and to see the greatness and the glory and the goodness and the faithfulness of God. And it'd be a lot easier if He just took it away, but you'd miss out on seeing those things of the Lord, learning about those things of the Lord. So if you're going through a time right now, open your eyes and look for the Lord. Open your eyes and look for where He's working in your life. Turn to His Word and have Him teach you where He's working in your life. Get on your knees, as we've talked about this morning, and ask Him to show you where He's working in your life. Because He's there. He's doing something. We just got to see what it is, no matter how big or small. So let's stand together.
Well, that's it for today's sermon. Again, we thank you for joining us. And just a reminder, for more information on our church, find us on Facebook or YouTube. We'll see you next week.